Welcome to our series on social capital. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the director of the Institute for Social Capital, and I'm joined by Lindon Robison, Emeritus Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Welcome, Lindon.
Thank you, Tristan. Good to be with you, and hello to all of you who may be joining us. We look forward to hopefully an interesting exchange today that you'll find interesting.
Lindon and I have both been working on the concept of social capital for a long time, with Lindon initially approaching it from economics, whereas I came from sociology and social theory. We're both very passionate about the concept, and our different backgrounds and perspectives make for interesting conversations and engaging debates. In this episode, we'll explore how social capital influences the production and exchange of commodities. So, Lindon, you were trained as a neoclassical economist. What led you to think about exchanges of commodities differently?
Well, great question, Tristan. And my training, yes, it was in neoclassical economics, and I've written articles and books on the subject, and found it to be very useful and helped explain a lot of things that I could observe. But at some point, I found that the emphasis on selfish behavior just simply didn't explain a lot of the behavior that I thought was important and tried to practice and motivated other people that I admired. So in effect, it wasn't that I was disregarding neoclassical economics. I just wanted to add something that would explain a lot of the exchanges and economic activity that didn't fit the selfishness of preference that was promoted in neoclassical economics. Although in some conditions, that's exactly the motive. But in general, human behavior is much more complicated than that.
I think last episode, I think we were discussing how relationships alter the motives that we have in terms of the nature, the way we produce and exchange. I guess now we're talking today about commodities. So can you talk a little bit more about what those motives are and how social capital influences the production and exchange of commodities?
Yes, we do have commodity needs, and I refer to commodities collectively as food and shelter and transportation and all of the things that make our lives enjoyable and useful. So we're surely not disregarding the need for commodities. But I think if there's one thing we've learned is that we have other social emotional needs. We need to belong. We need to feel important. We need to feel a connection to other people and be able to internalize what's happening to other people. And these important needs motivate us to do things that can't be explained solely or often at all by the incentive to increase our access to commodities. And if I could maybe follow up on that point, Tristan, it would be that as a trained economist, the one concept that that I thought we could all agree on was that specialization increased productivity. For example, in the early 17 or late 17, early 1800s, most people did everything themselves. They farmed, they made their houses, they made their clothes and so on, and not very productive. But as we specialize, we now find that we can do things much more efficiently and much more productively than when we didn't. Adam Smith acknowledged this point with his description of the production of pins, that one person working alone could scarcely make one pin a day, whereas 10 people specialized could make 28,000 or some large number. The number is in dispute, but that it's a large number is true. But the point that is often not made, in addition to specialization increasing productivity, is that we can't specialize if we don't trade with each other for what we gave up producing to specialize. And if we don't like each other, we're not likely to trade. And if we do like each other, we're more likely to trade than with strangers. And so, in my understanding, the foundation premise for economic productivity rests on social capital, on relationships between people. And we can't really address the issue of productivity unless we account for the importance of relationships.
So relationships then are fundamental to the economic system. And I guess in that regard, social capital effectively underpins the functioning of the economy.
Absolutely. And in fundamental ways. For example, we might tend to think of economic goods or commodities or things that you buy in the grocery store, at the gas station. You pay money and get the good, and you drive away and the transaction completed. But hardly, that's not a very accurate characterization of goods nor exchanges, because there are simply goods that don't fit the privately owned and produced commodity that's exchanged in a formal market between strangers motivated by selfishness. For example, in my neighborhood, we regularly will have a request from the school system to vote for a bond, namely to increase taxes on ourselves for the benefit of children. And many of us, our children are grown, yet we still vote for those. And it's not an economic decision that leads us to vote for those kind of public goods, but we recognize the importance to other people and people that we care about. And so we're called on frequently to make decisions that aren't for our selfish commodity interests. And society depends on our willingness to make those decisions.
So again, I guess public goods are underpinned by social capital. Without social capital, it would be difficult to see that we could have public goods. And it's those relationships that we have between people, between each other, that really determines whether or not these public goods are invested in.
Absolutely. A public good, for those that, whose background is not in economics, is simply defined as a good whose benefit is, you can't limit it. It's not excludable. For example, if I put a street light in my front yard, anyone driving by can benefit from it, and it doesn't really restrict the supply. And the problem with investing in public goods is, if I'm selfish, I have to receive enough benefit personally to invest in it. But if I can vicariously, because of social capital, benefit from what it produces for other people, then I'm more likely to invest in public goods. And so collectively, we have to say, I'm able to receive relational goods from certain things, even though I'm not receiving the good 100% myself.
And the same is largely true of common property resources as well. I'm a geographer, so in my undergraduate, of course, we were taught Garrett Harding's Tragedy of the Commons, and the idea that for a common property resource or a common good, that if everybody were to maximize their self-interest, they would maximize their extraction or utilization of that common good. And everyone would do the same thing using the same logic, and it would result in overuse of the common resource and therefore a tragedy. But what we see is that that doesn't happen where there's social capital, where there's relationships and people agree about the amount of use and other people's use and other people's access, and then we don't see a tragedy. So again, social capital underpins the use of common property resources as well.
Absolutely. And when we, and thankfully, we see places where where economic, selfish behavior might predict an overuse of the resource, but it doesn't happen, particularly when there's a relationship between people that that use and benefit from it. And I should say, Tristan, that we talk rather informally in this setting, but we do have references and citations that we'll make available on our podcast if you'd like to dig a little deeper.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that this is very well supported by academic work, and you've published quite extensively on some of these issues that we're talking about. So we'll make sure we post those resources on the podcast page. So I think, like, talking about common property resources, the selfishness predicts tragedy, and we've highlighted how quite often tragedy doesn't occur because of relationships. But where relationships do deteriorate and perhaps become undervalued, or in fact negative, then we often do see a tragedy when it comes to the use of common property resources. And I think this has been pretty well established also in the social capital literature, that connection between common property resources and the importance of relationships.
And I think you could even extend this principle to private property. We say it's private property and people manage it for their selfish interests and so on. But property rights are what we give to each other. And these depend on relationships that I respect because we have attachment value for laws and principles and respect each other's and take benefit from each other's security, that we give to each other property rights. We say, I'm not going to challenge your right to access what you claim to be your own because we agree on the institutions. We agree as neighbors and citizens that this is an important property. In fact, I'm reminded of a study the World Bank did several years ago of the benefits that accrue to migrants, particularly from Mexico, that receive a significant economic benefit from an economy where there are property rights, you can count on agreements being fulfilled, and so on, that oftentimes don't exist in some places.
And so even private ownership of resources, of anything, of goods, is based on relationships effectively. Like it may be regulated by institutions, but we all kind of need to agree that yes, in fact, you do own it, and we're going to respect that ownership. And so we can see so many parts of the economic system built on the foundation of relationships, and effectively social capital is what we're really talking about. That the economic system, the ownership of private goods, the exchange, the production, all of that is really based on social capital.
Yes, completely agree, Tristan. There is one other point that I think highlights the importance of social capital in the economy, and that is inequality of access to resources, whether it's school, healthcare, housing, so many things, that when these are just unequally distributed, it puts pressure on relationships. And so there's a connection between our support for institutions that we may view as not leading to sort of a fair or just distribution of resources, and our ability to have private property. So how do we move in the direction of creating an economy that has a more nearly equal distribution of income and resources? Something that, at least in the United States right now, we're moving away from, and reached a peak in the late 20s. And the answer is when we can include in our exchanges relational goods and are willing to make voluntary donations and pay taxes and so on, adopt other means for sort of accounting for disadvantaged and so on, they have important economic outcomes. And if we simply ignore those, it threatens our economic system.
So we started this talking about how relationships alter motives effectively. And so that's what we're really talking about, is we're talking about reducing inequality, building an economic system that is fairer, where it's more, I guess, productive and more efficient and more effective. And that occurs where we do connect with the importance of relationships, where we do have those relationships, and we allow ourselves to understand how relationships and the importance of relationships alter our motives, and I guess move us away from self-interest, or at least from selfishness, towards other reasons why we might act in ways that then ultimately end up being more productive and effective. Going back to the idea of a pin, that if we isolate ourselves and we focus purely on selfishness, then all of those aspects of collective action and cooperation that clearly are so incredibly beneficial and productive become more difficult and perhaps occur less often. And that has ripple effects throughout not only the entire economic system, but across the social system as well.
I couldn't agree more. And so I don't know how many times we've said this on this series of podcasts, that relationships really do matter all the time, every place and everything. And these relationships that are characterized by trust, empathy, regard, caring, and so on, that we associate with social capital, really produce beneficial outcomes. And they're not duplicated without them. I guess I'm becoming even more emphatic in saying that economic outcomes are absolutely tied to the kind of relationships we have with each other and in general. And social capital is critical for equality, for management of common resources, for investing in public goods, being able to specialize, maintain property rights. In every single economic outcome that we want to influence in a positive way, we depend on social capital.
Yeah, and I think there's been a tendency to almost see relationships and everything that is represented by social capital as being different from the economy. But like what we're talking about right now, it is the economy. Relationships are what makes the economy function. So the only reason why we might have some sort of false view that that isn't the case is because we've overlooked them, we've ignored them, we've removed them from our analysis and our understanding of the way the economic system works. But they're actually fundamental. They're not different and distinct from each other. And the more we can talk about social capital in these kinds of ways that reconnect us, the better we're going to understand the economic system and the ways in which we actually do produce and exchange commodities.
Yeah. I think to follow up on that excellent point, Tristan, is that we live in a very complicated world right now. We have supply chains that stretch across the globe, and exchanges between people that have never met or never will meet, that depend on international agreements and so on. And the extension of social capital to these large impersonal networks depends on what we have referred to as attachment value goods, agreement, and the value of certain things that we can trust, and people that adhere to the same values that enable us to have sort of the benefits of social capital, even when we're not in face-to-face exchanges with people in particular. I'm just amazed at we were in this last week in some port cities in Europe, and to see the docks filled with containers several stories high. It's impressive what's being traded around the world. And we couldn't do that without attachment value goods, institutions that have attachment value, travel rights, and agreements established at ports for unloading and loading and just distributing goods. It really is impressive what we've achieved, but these have been achieved by people. They didn't happen impersonally. They happened because people made agreements. They got together and they said, this is what we agree to, and now we can do it.
Yeah, and it's those relationships, it's those understandings that we develop with other people, the way we see ourselves connected to other people, that then provide the opportunity to form those kinds of agreements. And I often think about institutions and agreements as like a solidification or a crystallization of relationships, that we agree on something, and we have a connection with each other, and then we write it down, we formalize it, if you like. And it really just reflects the nature of the relationship that we had to start with, and then we can use that as a objective point of shared understanding that we can then use for the basis of exchange and production of commodities. But it still is grounded in the relationship that we originally had, and we need to continue to maintain that relationship for that agreement to have any weight. Agreements where the relationships fall apart, the agreement that's written down on paper doesn't mean anything if the relationship deteriorates. And so, everything that we're talking about is how fundamental relationships are to the functioning of the entire economic system.
I think that's if there's a message that I think I would like to stress today, and I think we both would stress this, that the economic system depends on relationships, and relationships is simply certain kinds of relationships we refer to as social capital.
Yeah, and we can invest in those relationships, and they represent a stock of future potential benefit, and therefore it is a form of capital. And I think that's the logic of what we're developing with the idea of social capital, and everyone tends to agree on much the same kind of thing, perhaps just sees it in slightly different ways. But it is important, like we've been discussing, to emphasize just how important and fundamental this is to our everyday lives, to the way we go about production, exchange of commodities, and the benefits that we get from it.
I think the evidence of that is that at the most fundamental unit, the household unit, that where social capital is most likely to exist, really accounts for a significant proportion of new businesses, new hires, business activities, really often have at their core some relationships between family members or extended family.
And it's that old saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know, that is
Absolutely.
so fundamental to the way we live our lives. Well, we've run out of time in this episode, Lindon. It's been fantastic discussing these topics with you, as always. Look forward to the next one.
Me too. Good to be with you, everyone.